Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good Tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it is dedicated in honor and in memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKoyen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yael HaKoyen Khan Olav Hashalom, and it is also in schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKoyen and Risha Katz L'Eirech Yomim V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We're at the conclusion of chapter 8, Perek Ches in Tanya, talking about secular wisdom in context of all the different types of interactions that we human beings have with the world around us. The purpose of our creation is to elevate and align the world, our own personal world, the interactivities we have with everything around us toward the divine, toward God's purpose. So there are things that are completely Kedusha and told mitzvahs, this is what you're supposed to do. This is the way you align your life with what God wants. There are things that are in the category that are not allowed and prohibited. That is destructive and that's toxic and antithetical to what God wants of us. And then there's the in-between, the Dvarim Mutarim that are allowed, that where we have told, align that also toward L'Shem Shemayim, toward godliness. So the Alter Rebbe has gone through all types of different scenarios, in action, in speech, in thought, things that we do, things that we speak about, things that we conceive, and all other different type of scenarios. The last piece is in the area of our minds. Where do we focus our minds? And it's understandable why the Alter Rebbe is concluding with that. Because after going, so to speak, from the bottom up, you go from what we eat, what we speak about, and then what we think about, where our minds are preoccupied. So here too, there are things that are a mitzvah to use your mind, and that's learning Torah. That we should learn Torah, use our minds to understand God's mind, to understand what God wants of us. Then there are things that we're not supposed to use our mind for, reading things that are inappropriate, things that are divrei minus, things that are sacrilegious, or even worse, that are talk about apicursus, denying God's existence, atheism, and so on, avodah zarah, idolatry. And then there are things like mathematics or science that are permitted. They're not dvarim asurim, they're klippas nega, but yet, in the process of us elevating all of our lives toward the divine, these are not necessarily focused on what God wants of us. It's focused more on understanding how the world works. So in that sense, that's what the Alter Rebbe is discussing now. And this has a unique element because you're using your mind. You're not just using your actions or your speech, but actually your mind, which is the most superior of our faculties. So what did we learn so far? So the Alter Rebbe said, so he spoke like this. He said that firstly we learned Esek b'chachmes u'mase elam b'chlal dvarim b'telim yachashiv le'inyan oven bittul teira. Now first of all, since it's not focused on what God wants of us, so it's considered bittul teira. That's already considered dvarim b'telim, even though it could be valuable and important. But in context of what is focused on what God wants, Torah, that's called bittul Torah, as we discussed last week. And in some ways, v'oidzos yiseda tumosa shel chachmas umas al tumas dvarim b'telim. That secular wisdom, in certain ways, is more contaminating than dvarim b'telim. To say it's dvarim b'telim, and we explained what that means. B'telim doesn't necessarily mean that it has no content. It means in context of where we should be focusing our minds and our words and our actions, which is toward the purpose of our lives. Like I gave the example. You're on a mission. You're an astronaut in space. Your focus has to be completely on your mission. So in that context, it's bittul Torah, but there's something additional here that's more than just wasteful words or worthless discussion, dvarim b'telim. And what is that? It's more contaminating, this tumah, shal chochmah more than the tumah, than the toxins of worthless discussion. Why? Because worthless discussion does not engage that superior faculty called the mind. She'ena malbisha metame rak hamidis. The midis, the emotions of a person. A person wants to be careless, or a person wants to be carefree, and just speaks, says things that are not necessarily important to speak about. Nonsense. Empty talk, idle talk, sometimes the expression is. So that's coming from the midis. And therefore that is metame, that toxifies, that pollutes our emotional attributes. The emotional attributes of what? Of the divine soul. However, secular wisdom, as we're going to learn shortly, contaminates and pollutes the divine soul's intellectual abilities, attributes, and faculties, which is far more engaging. So let's first read it and then we'll explain it. We learned in the end of chapter 1 that the animal soul, which is klippas nega, it's the radiant or the bright klippa, the bright husk or shell, because it's not sholosh klippas atmei, it's completely off limits. It's bright in the sense that it could be used, and translucent, it could be used towards something that is good, but it's also neutral in the sense it is a husk at the end of the day. It's a shell. Chochmas humas that he's talking about here, secular wisdom is in that category, klippas nega. So we learned that there's the four there's the four archetypes, or the four elements that are negative elements from which come the midas rois, as he explained. Negative temperaments. Talked about anger and arrogance. One of them, when he talked about dvarim b'telim, he said that comes from yesed haruach. Because ruach, what's ruach? What's air? It's empty. So that's why it symbolizes the idea of air, ruach, which means it flows freely, without resistance, just comes easily, but also it's empty, there's nothing in it. And that's why it's associated, remember, it's as an archetype. Its personality is similar to what dvarim b'telim is. Just like anger or fiery arrogance is connected to the passion of fire, and water, as he explained, is connected because water makes everything grow, to the pleasures of this world. And earth, its personality is the heaviest of all the elements. So it's atzlus, it's laziness, atzvus, depression, the heavy temperament, melancholy. So ruach is that lightheartedness, but lightheartedness that turns into folly, to just idle talk. So that's the ruach of the nefesh habamis. So what does that do to the nefesh halikis? So he says that the emotions of nefesh halikis is also in kedusha, also eish ruach mayim ofer. Though we didn't explain it, but it's obviously zelu umazeh, one corresponds with the other. So we have that idea. So when you say that ruach hakedesh shebenafesh halikis, which is the emotions of a person, Malbush Metame Rak Hamidis, which come from the Yesod Ruach HaKodesh, from the sacred element of wind or air, that gets polluted betumas klippas nega shebedvarim b'telim haboyim Yesod Ruach Hara shebeklippa zoy b'nefesh habamis. They become contaminated and polluted by the klippas nega impurity of worthless discussion, which comes from the animal soul's element of air, as we discussed earlier. Kidle'il, the Alter Rebbe says, where? At the end of chapter 1. So though he didn't discuss there the details, but he did mention the Dvarim B'Telim, now he's explaining, so when a person is occupied with the divine soul, the midas of the divine soul are focused on divine things. speaking about things that are divine and godly emotions. But when a person speaks dvarim b'teilim, wasted words, what is it doing? It's polluting that aspect of the Ruach HaKodesh, of the divine soul, is being polluted by the Ruach. That is the root of these empty, worthless words. So what's the point? That it's only affecting the midas shebenefesh. See, practically speaking, when a person speaks wasted words, and you get used to it, what does it do? It closes you up. It causes you to become insensitive, personally and emotionally, to more transcendent and divine objectives. That's what it does. Because you could say, what's the big thing? So I spoke something that was nonsense. I talked about the weather. I talked about things that were, we're not talking about dvarim asurim, things that are forbidden, like lashon hara. We're not talking about slander, gossip, or anything like that. Worthless, just said no value. Empty words, idle talk. But what's happening is that becomes your behavior. That's what you're doing. Your dibur, your levush called dibur, your speaking, has now spoken about things that are antithetical. They're not forbidden, but they're also not driven by the divine. So you become used to that. You see people who are used to that, and then they say, let's talk a little Torah. It's not so easy for them. It blocks them. Sometimes it's called in Chassidus timtum alev, but it's lev. So the emotions need the discipline to speak about things that are directed toward what God wants. But it's still only a tumah polluted of the heart, of the emotions. V'loi, he continues. V'loi b'chinas chochma bina das. Loi b'chinas chabad shebenafshe. Worthless discussion does not pollute the intellectual faculties of chochma bina das, of conception, understanding, and conclusion. And integration, as das is. That it doesn't do. Being, because these words, these worthless words, or worthless discussion, are words of nonsense and ignorance. Divrei shtus, nonsense and ignorance. Because even fools and uneducated can speak that way. It doesn't require any intelligence. So you see from that the mind is not being occupied with it. It's not being occupied with good things either, because when you're busy speaking, that's what you're focusing on. But it's not a heavy intellectual activity to speak nonsense. That's why everybody can do it. So it's not engaging the mind. It's not a person sitting and contemplating and deliberating and immersing themselves in understanding an intellectual idea. By contrast, however, secular wisdom, that does. It's malbish. It becomes like a garment. The mind now is directed and being preoccupied, and therefore contaminating and polluting the intellectual faculties of Chachma, Bina, V'das, of the divine soul. Because it's not just nonsense. It's not just idle talk. It's actually preoccupying the mind. And again, this could be science, it could be mathematics, it could be politics, political science. I didn't mean politics as in Dvarim B'Teilim. I meant that in the context of the intellect is being engaged. So now, it's not just Chochmah Chachgas, it's not just Ruach. Of the Midas, it's Chabad. And it's being contaminated, but Tumas Klipas Nega Shebachachma Selu, with the impurity and toxins of Klipas Nega, of the bright husk. Is still a bright husk because we're not talking about something that is trapped in the three harsh the impurities. Shalosh klipos atmeis. So it's a klipos nega, but it's being affected. So it's now reached also the mind. Practically speaking, when you see, for example, a person does something, let's say a person makes out of negligence, they make a mistake, or even deliberate, but it came just in passing. It wasn't a premeditated. We know, for example, first-degree murder, or premeditated. Obviously, we're not talking about murder here. We're talking about something much lighter than that, obviously, because we're not speaking about things that are osur, v'kosher b'derech etzenim. But just as an example, when you see somebody does something, okay, it came inadvertently or came easily, so it's still not a positive thing, but it's very different than when a person premeditates and uses their mind to strategize and to conspire. You know, when you hear, for example, how the Nazis planned the genocide of the Jewish people, what's chilling is not just the murder, which of course is the most horrific, but how they planned it. They used their minds. They used the most superior faculty of a person. It wasn't just in passing. Completely immersed the full mind in that type of activity. Again, I'm using an extreme example. So the same thing on a more subtle level is very different when a person is doing it more just emotional impulsively, someone speaking nonsense, is very different than when a person is premeditated and conspiring and using their mind and intellectual faculties. Because then that contaminates the Chachma Bina Das of the Nefesh Elikis. Now you could say, one second, what does one thing have to do with the other? Didn't we say there are two different souls? Where the animal soul is here, the divine soul is here. No, but there's one human being. And the mind can only go in one direction. If your mind, Chachma Bina Das, in your mind, is being preoccupied with things that are, in this case, talking about secular wisdom, which is not focused on God and the purpose of existence. He's going to give an exception when a person uses secular wisdom the right way, but we're not there yet. We're talking about just engaging in that. So the mind is fully involved and fully invested and fully engaged in what? In something that's not the divine. And that therefore pollutes not just the ruach, the midas, the emotions. So we're not talking about idolatrous or heretical teachings, which is forbidden. I mentioned before. But we're talking about general knowledge that is not directed toward godliness. Medicine, mathematics, and so on. And the answer is, why? Because it's not being driven toward the purpose of our existence. And in that context, it is a pollutant. But to explain it really, like even in a more the dynamics of it, if you wish, the chemistry of it, the dynamics of secular wisdom, the Alter Rebbe continues. He says, because this wisdom, this secular wisdom, how did it get here to this world? How is it possible in the first place? If God created existence, for the purpose, everything He created in this world is to honor God and to express the divine transcendent. So how is it possible in general that there should be any activity that is not aligned to that? And particularly the mind. The mind is the lofty and the superior qualities of our mind. How is it even possible? Why is not everything being directed to godliness? It was all came from God. So we know that is because God concealed His presence and allowed for these different faculties to come down to this world and have their own objective. We have that free will. So the Alter Rebbe says, because that secular wisdom, shenoflu shama b'shviras hakelim, that these, the tumah of klipas negesh b'chachmas elu, how did this chachmas, how did they get here to this world? They didn't just come regularly. They came through shviras hakelim, the shattering. They fall, shenoflu. They fell in a form what is called shattering of the vessels. So let's talk about that for a moment, what that means. So here are two things we need to emphasize, the falling and the shattering. So when there's a regular flow of energy, you don't call it fallen. It's not fallen angels, it's not fallen energy. It's a flow. It may go from a higher level down to a lower level, but it retains its personality. When something falls, immediately means it's not in its regular order. Like when we say a person falls, God forbid. Even if they don't break anything, nothing happens, but a fall means it's not regular, not walking, you slipped and fell. So right away indicates something that has become severed from its source to some extent. Shviras HaKelim is the classic example. If you take a container, let's take physically, and you shatter it, and the pieces fall over the place, fall in pieces, that's an example. That's not a regular flow. Something happened here. There was a tension that caused this shattering. Psychologically speaking, it's a form of dissonance. So the Kabbalists explain that before the world of Tikkun, there was a world of Tohu. That God, in the process of creating existence, with a point that He wants that this world should be a Dira B'Tachtenim, that in this lowest of worlds, we should turn it into a divine home. So how is it possible there should be Tachtenim? Simple question. Since God is the creator, and everything He creates is an extension of His energy, how is it possible there should be someone that denies God? How is it possible there should be an agnostic world, or an atheistic world, or things not aligned with what God wants? To put it even more bluntly, how could it be there even be klippus in the first place? How's there klippus? Everything should be kedusha, because everything is an extension of godliness. So if you were an artist and you created a piece of art, the art is an expression of you. So why is not the entire universe just an expression of God? But that's not what God wanted. He wanted the world to be, He wanted the godliness within it to be concealed, the purpose to be concealed, and we should discover it. To do that in a way that makes sense to us, He created a process which is called something that will fall. There'll be a shvira, there'll be a break, there'll be a dissonance, there'll be a disconnect. And that explains how it's possible. Because if there was none of that, the flow would be, yes, it could be a minimal flow. You could even conceal the divine. But how could there be a capacity that one should use their mind, or for that matter, anything, but the mind especially, which is a quality that human being was given, blessed with a mind. In that sense, we are in the divine image. We have a mind, the capacity to control our emotions, the capacity to rise above and transcend our subjectivity. Animals don't have that. There's nothing on earth that has that. That's a superior quality. Why is that not driven by the divine transcendence? Because it didn't just come down in a regular flow. These chokhmas elu, they fell here. There was a point where there was like a severing, shviras hakelim, that the containers, we're talking here not physical containers, we're talking about spiritual containers, that were imbalanced. And the tension between the energy and the container is what caused this shattering, which caused the falling. And what did it result in? That now you could have, yes, a piece of art of God that is not reflecting the artist in a revealed way. And we can make the mistake and use the wisdom of, let's say, chokhmas harafua, medicine, or chokhmas hacheshbon, mathematics, and not directed toward godliness. We could use it directed toward godliness. It's not stopping us from doing so, but that requires a special effort that we're going to learn about as we continue on in this chapter, the last lines of the chapter. But now, on its own, it's possible. Why is it possible? Because the artist concealed himself, but more than concealed himself, allowed these chokhmas to go, so to speak, wander off. Now, nothing wanders away because Eined Mavade, God is everywhere. But on their own, they can be a result of this shattering, and that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. So in one line, he's explaining how it's possible there should be klippus in the first place. So even though he talked about klippus before, but it's even stronger the question when you talk about choch Chabad. Because when you talk about Maisa action, so you could say there, because there's no divine wisdom in it. It's just a product. So the product, meaning the behavioral or an action-based, can be perhaps concealed from the divine purpose. But when you talk about Chabad, as I said, these are the faculties that define us as human beings. How is it possible they should be even something that's not directed toward their purpose? And again, we're not talking about things that are forbidden. We're talking about things that are just not like the astronaut that's reading books that have nothing to do with his mission. It may be good intelligence. How is that possible? Because it came through b'derech nefila shenoflu shama b'shviras hakelim. The goal is, shvira is to misaken. Just like it fell, there's the concept of elevating, and fixing and repairing the broken containers. And we're going to learn how we do that. But right now, on its own, Chochmas Ha'olam, or what he calls secular wisdom, what we were discussing, has that capacity. So again, to read it inside, so when a person is Eisik in Chochmas Ha'olam, with the pollutants of the klippas nega. How is it possible a klippa? A shell should only be a shell to the fruit inside. So how is it possible that it should be a pollutant? Because because there's a disconnect. There's a dissonance between the fruit, or we should say between the shell and the fruit within. Shenoflu shama. They fell there. Where? Into the klippas nega b'shviras hakelim mibchinas hacharayim shel chochma d'kedusha. So now he adds, not just shviras hakelim, that it's mibchinas hacharayim shel chochma d'kedusha ki yadua liyedei chen. So this adds even another point. So we have naflu, now b'shviras hakelim, the shattering, and where did it originate from? Because here you could ask the question, if it originated from Chochmah D'Kedusha, which is divine wisdom, so how is it even subject to something that would fall? Why would it fall? So he says it comes from Acharayim Shel Chochmah D'Kedusha. It comes like the backside of the sacred and holy Chochmah. As it's known to those familiar with Chen, Chochmah Nistara, with the secret wisdom. So that adds one more point. That first there's Chochmah D'Kedusha. Everything is aligned with godliness, and the mind as well. That Chochmah D'Kedusha has a backside to it. From that backside, which is not as intense as Pnim, like when a person's looking at you, it's much less likely that you're going to defy them. But if they turn their back to you, then it's like in a way they're ignoring you. So the Acharayim of Chochmah, which God created, the Sheder Ishtalshalos, that there's Ponim v'Acher, there's levels that are shine very dark. We say Ponim b'Ponim, face to face, and then there are levels that are like the backside. So the backside of Chochmah D'Kedusha is more vulnerable and more prone to be impacted by the nefila of Seder Ishtalshalos, of Shviras HaKelim, which in turn creates a Chochmah that can be disconnected, at least ostensibly, and on a revealed level, from the Chochmah of Kedusha, and that's why it can be a pollutant. A klippas nega that pollutes the mind of the person. What does pollute means? It's not directed to where it should be. That's already a pollutant, as we discussed at length. The next section in Tanya is going to explain that this is not it's not an exclusive scenario. There's a way that we can direct our minds, even secular wisdom, toward the divine, and that's going to be the final section of chapter 8. But here we learn now this idea, this concept, how it's possible, and therefore why it pollutes. And it's a fundamental principle. I'll try to elaborate more on this in the next year. We'll stop here. And please go to TanyaApplied.com, where you can find all the previous classes and also submit any questions. Everyone have a very good week and a very meaningful and soul-searching and introspective Chedesh El. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.